There is a place in Egypt where nothing stands anymore. The ground is flat, crossed by low moderns and one obelisk of red granite that dates to the reign of Senusret I, roughly 1950 years before the Common Era. That obelisk is the last visible trace of what was once the most important religious site in the ancient world. The Egyptians called it Ayunu, the city of the pillar. The Greeks called it Heliopolis, the city of the sun. For over 2,000 years, this was where Egypt kept its oldest knowledge, where its priests maintained the longest unbroken tradition of ritual on the planet, and where the theology that shaped every dynasty from the first to the last was written, copied, taught, and guarded. Almost nothing from its library survives. The temple complex was dismantled over centuries, its stone quarried and carried north to build Cairo and Alexandria, its archives scattered or buried or burned. What remains are fragments, most of them found elsewhere, in pyramid chambers at Saqqara, in coffin inscriptions from the Middle Kingdom, in later copies made by scribes who understood they were preserving something that was already disappearing in their own time. Among those fragments is a passage that does not describe a ritual. It describes the morning after one. A priest walks a stone corridor that runs east to west beneath the temple before dawn. He carries a clay vessel of oil for the lamps, bread for the offering table, beer in a jar sealed with wax. He speaks an invocation so old that parts of it were already archaic in his own language, phrases his mouth shaped better than his mind understood. The walls on either side hold carved texts in clean vertical columns. The ceiling above him is painted dark blue with gold stars, meant to mirror a sky the corridor cannot see. He sets out the bread, he lights the oil, he speaks the name of the god, and then he waits. No answer comes. The passage does not describe a failed ritual. It does not blame the priest. It does not suggest error. What survives, in terms that no modern translation has fully settled, describes a morning when the gods rose from their places and moved together toward the western horizon. Not in war, not in anger, not as punishment for anything the living had done. The text says they departed, all of them, together, and the corridor stood silent, and the bread sat untouched, and the sun came up anyway. Three things come out of that passage that are almost never discussed together. The first is what the text actually says, word by word, and how long it sat before anyone attempted a full translation. The second is what was happening to Heliopolis and its archive at the time, and why the one place that should have explained everything was never recovered. The third is whether the priest went back the next morning, and the morning after that, and what it means that according to the surviving record, he did. The answers sit in places most people never look. The oldest of them are at Saqqara, cut into the walls of a burial chamber that was sealed for more than 4,000 years. That was the end of the Old Kingdom. Roughly 2,100 years before the Common Era, give or take a generation, depending on which chronology you follow. To understand what the priest was standing in, you have to go back further, to the centuries when Heliopolis was not a ruin, but the center of the world. At its height, the temple complex at Ayunu covered an area larger than most Egyptian cities. It held schools, libraries, observatories, workshops for the manufacture of sacred objects, and a priesthood that operated in rotating shifts, day and night, every day of the year, without interruption. The priests of Heliopolis were not monks. They were the administrative and intellectual core of the Egyptian state. They maintained the calendar, they tracked the flooding of the Nile, they recorded the names of the stars and assigned them to gods, and in doing so, they built a theological architecture so complete that it lasted, without fundamental change, for longer than any other system of thought in the documented record. Over 2,500 years, nothing else comes close. The daily rite was the spine of it. Every morning, in every major temple in Egypt, but above all in Heliopolis, a priest entered the innermost chamber, broke the seal on the shrine that held the image of the god, washed the figure, anointed it with oil, dressed it in fresh linen, placed bread and beer before it, and spoke the words that invited the god to inhabit the image. The Egyptians did not believe the statue was the god. They believed the god chose to reside in it, the way a person might choose to sit in a particular chair. The ritual was the invitation. The presence, if it came, was the answer. That distinction matters because it changes what the departure passage means. The text does not say the statue cracked or the shrine fell. It says the presence stopped arriving, the oil burned, the bread sat, the words were spoken, and nobody came. We still do not know what the full passage says, because the fragments that carry it have never been assembled into a single continuous translation. But the tradition it belongs to left traces across nearly every major Egyptian text that followed. And the oldest of those traces are not on papyrus. They are cut into stone, in a place that was locked in the dark for 4 millennia. In 1881, inside the pyramid of Unas at Saqqara, a French archaeologist named Gaston Maspero entered a burial chamber that had been sealed since roughly 2350 years before the Common Era. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, in vertical columns of hieroglyphs painted in blue-green pigment. No images, no scenes of daily life, only text. Hundreds of lines of it, pressed into every surface, including the underside of the lid of the sarcophagus. These were the pyramid texts, and they turned out to be the oldest corpus of religious writing ever discovered, not the oldest inscription. The oldest sustained body of theological thought committed to a surface that survived. Kurt Sethe, the German philologist who spent decades compiling them, concluded that many of the spells were far older than the pyramid itself, composed centuries, or even millennia, before they were carved at Saqqara, passed down through an oral tradition that the Heliopolis priesthood maintained, and eventually set in stone when the old certainties began to crack. The texts describe a world in which the boundary between the gods and the living is thin. The dead pharaoh ascends to the sky and joins the gods. He sails with Ra in the solar boat. He eats with them. He speaks with them. The language is not metaphorical. It is direct, physical, almost domestic. The gods are present, reachable, answerable. The sky is not a metaphor. It is a place with a geography, and the pyramid texts provide something close to a map. Raymond Faulkner, the British Egyptologist who produced the standard English translation in 1969, noted that the oldest layers of the pyramid texts assume a relationship between gods and humans that later Egyptian texts no longer take for granted. Something shifted between the time those spells were composed and the time they were carved. The relationship that the earliest material treats as ordinary, the later material treats as lost. And that shift points to a document that most people have never heard of, housed not in Egypt, not in London, not in Chicago, but in a museum in northern Italy. 1,100 miles northwest of Saqqara, in the Museo Egizio in the city of Turin, a papyrus sits under glass in a climate-controlled case. It arrived in 1824 as part of a collection purchased by the King of Sardinia, and when the scholars unrolled it, they found something that no other surviving document provides. A list of every ruler of Egypt, from the gods to the pharaohs, in order, with reign lengths. The Turin Royal Canon, as it came to be called, begins not with Menes, or Narmer, or any human king. It begins with the gods, Ra, Shu, Geb, Osiris, Set, Horus. Each one listed with a reign measured in hundreds or thousands of years, the way a bureaucratic record lists a dynasty. After the gods come the demigods, and after the demigods come what the text calls the spirits of the dead, and only then, after columns of divine and semi-divine rule, do the human kings begin. The papyrus is in poor condition. Large sections are missing. Some fragments have been matched and reassembled. Others sit in trays with no clear position. But what survives is consistent. The scribes who composed this list did not treat the Age of the Gods as mythology. They treated it as administration. These were rulers. They governed. They had durations, and then they ended. That in itself is striking enough. A culture recording its gods not as symbols or stories, but as former heads of state, with measurable terms of office. But here is where it pulls against everything the pyramid texts assumed. The Turin Canon records an ending. The reign of the gods stops. The reign of the demigods stops. The reign of the spirits stops. And then ordinary men sit on the throne, and the document shifts register, as though a door had closed and everyone in the room understood that it was not going to open again. If you read the pyramid texts and the Turin Canon side by side, they do not tell the same story. The pyramid texts describe a world where the gods are near, reachable, present. The Turin Canon describes a world where the gods were once near, once reachable, and then left, in a sequence the scribe laid out as carefully as a tax record. Between those two documents sits a question nobody has cleanly answered. When did the Egyptians stop believing the gods were here and start believing the gods had gone? And what happened in between? The answer to that question is in a third text, and it does not describe the departure gently. The text is called the Book of the Heavenly Cow, and it survives because it was carved into the walls of a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb belongs to Seti I, who ruled Egypt roughly 1,300 years before the Common Era, well into the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after the Old Kingdom fell. The walls of his burial chamber carry one of the most complete surviving copies, and the scene it describes is older than anything around it. The narrative begins with Ra ruling over gods and humans together, not from the sky, on the earth, walking among them, visible, present in the way a king is present. The humans and the gods share the same ground, and then, according to the text, the humans begin to turn. They plot, they rebel. The language is blunt. Ra sends his eye, in the form of the goddess Hathor, to punish them, and she does, with a violence the text does not soften. But that is not how it ends. After the punishment, Ra does not restore order. Ra says he is weary. The word the text uses carries the sense of exhaustion, of something worn through, not from a single event, but from the accumulated weight of being present in a world that no longer wants to hold still. And then Ra rises, not in fury, in fatigue. The sky goddess Nut transforms into a great cow and carries him upward, away from the earth, into the sky, and the other gods follow, and the ground below is left to the humans, alone. That is the moment the priest in the corridor was standing inside. Not a punishment, not an abandonment, a withdrawal that the text frames as the god's own choice, made not out of anger, but out of something closer to sorrow. And we still have not reached the worst part, because the departure in the Book of the Heavenly Cow does not happen in a vacuum. It happens at a hinge point in Egyptian history that is documented, datable, and catastrophic. The Old Kingdom of Egypt, the age of the Great Pyramids, the age of centralized divine kingship, collapsed around 2180 years before the Common Era. The pharaoh Pepi II, who according to the ancient sources reigned for over 90 years, died, and after his death, the central state came apart. The provinces broke away. The Nile floods, which had been reliable for generations, grew erratic. Famine spread through the delta. The priesthood at Heliopolis, which had operated without interruption for over 1,000 years, found itself in a country that could no longer feed or fund the institutions that had held it together. This was not a decline. The surviving texts describe it as a rupture. James Henry Breasted, the American Egyptologist, who spent his career at what is now the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures at the University of Chicago, called it the first dark age in recorded history. The centralized state that had built the pyramids, maintained the calendar, and supported the temples simply stopped functioning, and the theological consequence was immediate. If the pharaoh was the living link between the gods and the people, and the pharaoh's authority collapsed, then what did that say about the gods? Were they still present? Had they ever been? The silence in the corridor was not only spiritual, it was political. And the texts that survive from the period that followed carry the sound of people trying to make sense of a world that had come apart at the level where meaning itself was stored. One of those texts sits today in the Rijksmuseum van Oudheden in Leiden, in the Netherlands. It is a papyrus known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer. Its catalog number is Leiden I344. Its date is debated. Some scholars place it in the First Intermediate Period, the era that followed the Old Kingdom collapse. Others argue it was composed later, looking back. But its content is not debated. Ipuwer describes a world inverted. The river runs with blood, the poor wear linen, and the rich go barefoot. The grain stores stand empty. The dead are thrown into the river because there is no one left to perform the rites. The passage that resonates most with the departure tradition is brief and quiet, almost parenthetical. Ipuwer says that the offerings are no longer made, and that the temples stand open, and that what was hidden is now exposed, and that the sacred formulas, which were once guarded, are spoken aloud by anyone who finds them. That is not a description of invasion. It is a description of erosion, of a world where the structures that held meaning in place have dissolved, and the meaning has leaked out, and the people left standing do not know how to put it back. And at the center of that world, somewhere beneath the rubble that would eventually become the suburb of Ain Shams, on the northeastern edge of modern Cairo, the corridor at Heliopolis still ran east to west, and someone still walked it. We know that because the tradition did not die. The priesthood of Heliopolis survived the collapse. The rites continued through the First Intermediate Period, into the Middle Kingdom, into the New Kingdom. Priests still lit the oil, still set out the bread, still spoke the invocation. For another 1,500 years after the Old Kingdom fell, through foreign occupation, civil war, famine, plague, and conquest, someone walked that corridor and performed the rite, knowing, if they had read their own texts, that the passage on the wall described a morning when the answer stopped coming. That is what the text preserves. Not the departure itself, not the theology of withdrawal, not the politics of a collapsed state. It preserves the decision to continue. Someone stood in a corridor that the text said was empty and chose to light the oil anyway. Not because the God had answered, because the corridor was still there, because the words were still on the wall, because stopping would have meant that the silence was final, and continuing meant that it might not be. And someone, in that same tradition, at some point during or after the collapse, thought that moment was important enough to write down on something that would last. Not the age of the gods, not the great deeds of Ra, not the flood or the punishment or the glory. The morning after, the silence. The priest who went back. Now picture the corridor, not as a ruin, as it was. The oil burning in a shallow dish, the blue ceiling with its gold stars, the paint starting to crack at the edges after 1,000 years. The bread on the table, untouched from yesterday, the smell of old grain and warm stone, and whatever the river carried through the walls that season. A man standing in sandals on a floor that his grandfather swept, speaking words his grandfather spoke, to a room that his grandfather believed was occupied. And the room answering nothing. That passage sat in fragments for centuries. Pieces of it surfaced in collections across 3 countries, in museum drawers labeled with numbers, and filed under headings that did not invite curiosity. The theological tradition it belongs to, the departure of the gods, the withdrawal of Ra, the transition from the age of the divine to the age of the human, runs through Egyptian literature like a thread that nobody pulled. The pyramid texts assume the gods are here. The coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom ask how to reach them. The Book of the Heavenly Cow explains why they left. And the fragments from the end of the Old Kingdom describe what it felt like to be the one left behind. Adolf Erman, the German Egyptologist who built the Berlin Dictionary of Egyptian and who read more ancient Egyptian texts than perhaps any other person in his century, wrote that the theological shift between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom was the most significant change in Egyptian religious thought in the entire pharaonic period. He described it carefully, as Erman described everything, but even in his measured language you can hear the weight of it. A civilization that had organized itself around the physical presence of the gods reorganized itself around their absence. And it did not collapse under that weight. It continued. It built new temples. It composed new texts. It carved new walls, and every morning, in the corridor at Heliopolis, someone lit the oil. That is what the text preserves, and that is why it is not a relic. It is a record of the decision that every tradition eventually faces. Not whether the gods are real, whether it matters to keep going when the room does not answer back. The priest did not have proof. He had a corridor, a lamp, a loaf of bread, and words his grandfather taught him, and he walked down those stairs in the dark and spoke them anyway, into the silence, without knowing whether anything heard. And here is what stays. Of everything we went through tonight, there is one thing that does not leave: the bread. Sitting on the table from the day before, untouched, in a room painted like the sky, in a that held the oldest continuous tradition of its kind. Someone placed it there knowing that the bread from yesterday had not been taken, and placed it again anyway. Not faith in the way the word gets used now, clean and confident and finished, something rawer. The willingness to act without an answer. That is not ancient history. That is the shape of something anyone recognizes. The prayer you keep saying after the room goes quiet. The letter you keep writing after the replies stop. The door you keep opening, in case tonight is different. Not because you know, because stopping is a kind of knowing you are not ready for. The passage does not say whether the gods heard. It does not say whether the priest believed they would come back. It records only the act, the corridor, the oil, the bread, the name spoken aloud in a room that gave nothing in return. And it was written on something that lasted, which means someone decided that the act itself, not the result, was what mattered enough to survive. Next week we go deeper, into the Turin Papyrus, the king list that puts the gods on the throne for thousands of years and then stops, mid-line, at a name nobody can read. If you want to be here when we open that, stay with us. One story a week that did not fit the official version. And write to me below the video. Have you ever kept doing something long after the reason for it was gone? Not because anyone asked you to, but because stopping felt worse than continuing. Tell me what it was. I read them. That corridor runs beneath a modern suburb now. Ain Shams, on the northeast edge of Cairo, built over the ground where Heliopolis stood. Nobody has excavated it fully. The obelisk of Senusret stands in a small park behind a fence, surrounded by apartment blocks and traffic. Somewhere beneath that ground the corridor still runs east to west, and the blue ceiling with its gold stars is either collapsed or buried or, possibly, sealed in a pocket of dry air that has not been opened in over 3,000 years. And if it is, the bread is still on the table.